start. I didn't set this over here. Or I could just sit in the chair.
Yeah, whatever.
Okay. Well, thank you for letting me come into your house. Is this mine?
Yeah, that's yours.
Okay.
Just take it with you if you want to.
Now,
what are you going to do, ask questions or something?
Yeah. I'll just ask you questions. I mean, let me explain that I'm doing this for, this is a volunteer effort because I'm interested in history. I grew up, I got to Denver when I was 1 year old from Hollywood.
Yeah.
Have a lot of roots in Denver. And I have a good friend of mine's a historian there.
Yeah.
So I got to know those people in the course of doing some news work, and so this is just a volunteer effort. I think you're probably victim number 7,
Okay.
something right around there in this deal. So what we're doing is making these, and then I copy them over to a VHS and give it to them, and also I try and transcribe them.
Well, they're kind of little vignettes.
It's just a whole interview, and then but what I would really like to do is see if I can get them to shell out some money if they have any, and then we can go and look at the transcripts and edit something that makes a little program.
Yeah.
Sort of just the story of Tyler. So my focus on the interviews really ends up not being, I mean, it's World War II, and some of the foreign expeditions people are involved in are important, but really the focus is the town and the culture. It's an unusual area, and it's an unusual town, and so that's kind of what I'm looking for.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what I know, or what I can tell you, you know.
Okay. Well, why don't you start by telling me your name, your full name, and tell me about your family, and then your earliest reminiscences of being a kid.
Okay, well, my name is Charles R. Finlayson. I'm known as Chuck here in Tyler. My father was raised in Denver, graduated from Manual High School there. My mother was born in Kansas and moved to Denver when she was just a small girl. She graduated from South Denver High. They married in Denver after World War I, and my father heard about the oil business and decided he would immigrate to Texas. And he came to Texas when just before the Burke-Burnett boom. He landed in Wichita Falls. To make a long story short, we moved all over. They were living in Ranger and Easton, and then when I came along, actually I was conceived in Texas, but I was born in Colorado. Because when I came along, my mother went home to her mother at 157 South Clarkson, where I was born. And then a month later, she came back to Texas, and we moved to Breckenridge.
Texas?
Breckenridge, Texas.
Okay.
My brother was born 2.5 years later in Breckenridge. And we moved once to Pampa and back to Breckenridge, once to Amarillo and back to Breckenridge, and then we moved to Midland. And in 1930, when the East Texas oil field came in October, when Dad Joyner drilled his discovery well, my father came from Midland down here to Tyler to take part in the oil boom.
About what year was that?
That was in 1930. He came down here in December 1930, and I was in school at the time. So my mother and my brother and I waited until May of 31 when school was out, and then we moved to Tyler. So that's when we came to Tyler in May of 1931.
What grade were you in?
Huh? I was in the 3rd grade.
Oh, you were young.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. What school did you end up going to?
I went to Gary Elementary School.
Where's that?
That's on South Chilton, across from, at the time, old Gus Taylor who was president of a bank here. Lives a big home up there now. I think the Caldwell Foundation owns it now, right across from the street from Gary's School. And we moved several times in Tyler before we actually settled down. It was hard to find a place to live at that time. At the first place we stayed, there were 4 of us lived in 1 bedroom. That was all you could get. But later on we rented an apartment, and then we rented a duplex, and then we rented a home. And then later on, quite a few years later, my father bought a home here. But when we came to Tyler, it was 17,000 people. And of course, it just mushroomed with the oil boom. Before the oil came, Tyler was strictly what I would call a railroad town. And most of your city leaders and wealthy people, so to speak, lived in North Tyler, because that's where they all lived at that time. Well, when the new people came in, the oil people, well, there wasn't any place to live, so they started expanding to the south. And now, of course, Tyler has expanded to the south tremendously. And I don't know, I guess the population of Tyler now must be 85,000.
I heard 125 now.
Well, I know the county is around 150.
Is it?
But, you know, that's about 5 times what it was when we came here, which is what, about 70 years.
When did you think it really began to explode? What decade?
Well, I would say in the 30s. You know, it really exploded because it was right in the depths of the Depression. And there were people that came from all over the country here for this oil boom. They didn't have anything, no jobs, and they came to where there was a boom going on. And it exploded at that time. Now, granted, it's grown a lot more since then, but I would say the 30s and early 40s when it really expanded. Of course, after the war, I mean, you know, then now there are what, 1, 2, 3 high school, public high schools, and more private schools. But all in all, Tyler has always been what I'd say is a very nice, livable town. You don't have the hurly-burly of a city, and yet in some places you do, like the Loop, but basically it's a quiet, nice town to live in and raise your children.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
I had one brother, like I said, he was born in Breckenridge, Texas, and my brother passed away 12 years ago this month.
How old was he
In
when?
1988, he was 62. And so happened my mother passed away that same year in March of 1988. My father passed away in July of 1981, or 1977. He was 81 years old. So actually I have no family left here now. I'm the only one. I had a little boy that died in 1948, but I haven't had no children since then.
How old was your little boy?
Well, he was just born.
Oh, just
Yeah,
newborn.
he died soon after he was born.
So at this time you don't have children?
I didn't understand.
No children?
No, have no children. My brother had 3 children, and they all live away from here now.
Do you see them?
No, I don't see them very often. The girls, he had 2 daughters, and they lived up on the East Coast in South Carolina and Virginia, last I heard. And his boy lived down in Eagle Pass, Texas. I talked to him all the time. He's paralyzed from the neck down. He was in a bad automobile accident. He's been that way for about 23 years now. He lives on a respirator.
That's a long time.
Oh, it is. He's an amazing boy, well, I'll say that for him.
Yeah. I worked with quadriplegics for 12 years.
Did you?
With attorneys.
Yeah.
Day in the life of.
Well,
In fact, I just got back from Denver.
Did you?
Doing one, yeah.
Well, Bud was injured in an automobile accident down at Sugar Land one night. Didn't hit a car. The boy driving the car just went into a ditch and it threw him forward. He'd broken his neck playing football, and they fused the number 3 and 4 I forgot what you call it back there, and when he hit the windshield, it broke above that, and he was on the highway out there at night, and it took him a long time. They took him into Sugar Land Hospital and finally got him to tear down there in St. Luke's, but it was too late. But he's a great example for people because he's never been bitter, and he was a big old strapping boy, and now he can't even scratch his nose.
Yeah, I know.
You've worked with him, so you know.
Long time.
Right.
Yep.
But he's what I'd say, he's a really, and he's become a very observant person.
Mm-hmm.
He can analyze people real fast.
I'm just kind of curious. I did this so long. Was there ever any liability? Was he able to get some medical coverage?
No, he never got a dime. The boy driving didn't have anything.
Terrible.
So he never got anything. But you know, that's the way it is. Nowadays they'd probably sue the automobile manufacturer. I don't know. You know.
Yeah, they get a settlement.
Some kind.
It's getting tough though. There's caps, and sometimes it's not right.
But he's never been bitter or anything. He just, I've got a little brochure he wrote in there. He takes a thing, he put it in his mouth, and he writes on a computer.
I know, it's the new technology. People realize it's really mostly for handicapped people. It really makes their life.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
and then of course
we all think it's for us, but it's not really. We don't really need that stuff.
Well, another good thing, they have the telephone fix where he can talk. You know, and he taught it for over a month after the accident. He couldn't talk, but he finally learned to see his lungs don't work.
Yeah. Oh, I know.
But he learned to flex his neck muscles some way and make him breathe. And the doctors were very much against him doing that, but he said, well, I'm not going to lie here on a respirator. And so he'll get off the respirator for a while, and he can talk over the phone, but he has to breathe, you know, some way. But he's a great inspiration, I think, to many people. When you think you're bad off, while you see somebody like that, you really, you know, kind of come to your senses a little.
Yeah, and it's something where healthy people say, well, I kill myself. And there's probably is some suicide rates, but until it happens to you, you don't know.
That's right.
Then it happens to you. What are you going to do? But anyway, I didn't want to get off on that, but it's sort of up my alley a little bit.
Up your alley, isn't it?
Yeah, because I know a lot of people in that situation.
Alice and I have been married. I was married before, and she was married before, but we've been married 28 years now. And we've been in this home now for 23 years. And it was an old house when we bought it, and of course it's older now. But it's a comfortable old house. And it's a nice area of the city.
Oh, it's pretty.
Yeah, it is, and she works hard in the yard. She loves to do yard work.
I wanted to compliment her on that yard. It's we bought a house about 15 months ago. Not too far from here. It's right off.
Did you?
It's off Woodland Hills, Apple Tree, right in that corner.
Well, that's great.
And boy, we it's a lot of work.
Yeah,
and I saw your yard, and I thought, oh man. I'll take a picture of it, but I'm not going to show my wife. She'll think of new projects for me to do.
Well, you know, I used to work in the yard some. I'd mow the lawn and everything, but I can't do it anymore.
Can you use a riding mower?
Well, yeah, but we have these terraces.
Yeah, you need the self-propelled.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you don't want to risk.
But I give her all the credit, boy. She's got a green thumb, and she loves to do yard work. You know, working with flowers and things.
Well, she does a great job, and what I really like is her eye for color.
She's got a good. You're right.
It's real something special about it.
You know, that's one thing going back that I remember about Denver. Of course, we used to visit there. Denver was a beautiful city, boy. At the time I was growing up, and we'd go up there and visit. Washington Park, we used to go over there, boy, and play tennis and do everything. Beautiful city. And I've been back now. Well, the last time I was in Denver was in 1992, I think.
Oh, you've seen it.
Or 93, it was in 93.
Changed. Yeah.
But it's really spread out now.
Well,
Well, you know, it's all the suburb cities around it have almost grown into each other, haven't they?
yeah, it's depressing for me. I love Denver, and I had to leave because the cost of housing,
Yeah.
it was up about the level of like San Francisco or
Yeah.
Los Angeles. And come on, it's only Denver.
That's right.
I mean, it's a beautiful town.
I agree with you.
It just hurts me to go back. In fact, if you were to go back tomorrow, even from '92, like, you know, that Lodo area downtown,
Yeah.
where the warehouses were,
Yeah.
I'm sure they're working on it then.
Uh-huh.
I call it the practicing run for future alcoholics of America.
Is that right?
They get mad, they kick out all the bums,
Yeah.
and what do they build? Must be 10,000 bars on that strip.
Oh, really? Good night.
And then they have Coors Stadium. They
Yeah.
couldn't think of a better name, and you know, yeah, Coors helped, but so did the taxpayers. So I don't know. Don't get me started on it. But I'm fortunate because my family live there. My mom
Well,
and
they
dad
still
are
live there?
alive.
They still live there?
They still live
That's
there.
good.
My brother is an attorney,
Well, that's good.
and he's married, and they live in Lakewood.
Uh-huh.
And
Well, that's good.
But-
I've always liked Denver. Of course, I haven't been there a lot since I've grown up.
right.
But back to Tyler, I've always liked Tyler. I don't know, we moved him around so much when I was a boy that I think in a way there was a feeling in me I'd like to be a part of someplace. Because you'd move to a new town and everybody say, oh, that's my Uncle Jim, or that's my cousin so-and-so. And you know, I never did run into that. We didn't have any relatives around. But it always kind of made me wish that I'd be a permanent part of some community, you know, live there where you grow up and have brothers. And so I've always enjoyed time. The worst thing about it is the hot weather.
Yeah.
But it's a beautiful place, and everybody comes here. I had a friend that visited me here from Boston, and he couldn't believe that this was Texas. You know, most of them are looking for the prairie or something.
Yeah.
And he fell in love with Tyler. In fact, I introduced him to the mayor.
Kevin?
Well, this was before Kevin, Smith Reynolds.
I know Smith.
And Smith came by here and presented him with a letter as a citizen of Tyler. And this friend of mine, he's a doctor up at Harvard. When Wack got back, he sent $25. He said, here's my down payment on my taxes as a new citizen of Tyler. Sent it to old Smith.
Smith lives next to John Gaston, who runs the ad department over at KTK.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. John's been there a long time.
Well, anyway, that's just a sidelight on how people come from different places, just like you came to Denver. I mean, they all seem to be amazed, you know, if this is Texas.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always felt that the people that settled Tyler originally, as I understand, a lot of them came from Alabama and Tennessee.
Yes.
And I spent a little time in Alabama, southern Alabama. And it's a lot like East Texas. Soil is red, and your trees and everything are very similar. And I can imagine that when those people went west, all of a sudden they came to East Texas and said, well, this is home, just like home.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell me a little about what your day was like once you got kind of in town in Tyler. Tell me about what your morning ritual and day was like when you were a kid. Who did what?
Well,
while you talk, I'm going to check something.
Yeah, when we finally settled on a home that we rented, it wasn't an apartment or a duplex. Why, we got into a routine then. I mean, I was going to Gary Elementary School. And later on, of course, I went over to James S. Hall Junior High School. Well, my routine primarily was first thing my brother and I had to do the dishes at night. And he was smarter than I was. He would end up dropping a dish or something while we were doing it, and my mother would come in there and run him off. And when I'd start to leave, she said, "No, you stay there and continue washing the dishes. I'll drive." But anyway, we mowed and raked the yard. In those days, you burned the leaves. And we always had our chores and duties around the house. And my mother, until I was in junior high school, one thing she insisted on for both of us, we had to take a nap in the afternoon. And we just hated that. And now, you know, you'd give your place in heaven almost to be able to take a nap every afternoon.
Times change, don't they?
Yeah, they do. But anyway, we moved into a home that was about 4 blocks from Gary, so we would walk to school and back. And then after we got into Hogg, well, we moved out farther on Chilton, 1312 South Chilton we lived at. And we walked and rode bicycle to Hogg Junior High. From there, and you know, most like all kids, when most of your routine then was when you came home, the first thing your folks would say, "Do you have any homework?" And if you have, get in there and get to work on it. One of my real vivid memories is when my dad said, "Well, it's time for you to learn to drive, Charlie." I said, "Oh, I don't want to, Pop. You know how most kids want to drive." I said, "No." He said, "Yeah, get in the car and let's go."
How old were you?
I was about 13.
Right.
And he'd take me out. I'll say one thing for him, he had a lot of patience. And you know, in those days you had a clutch and the gear shift on the floor and everything. And you had to learn to let it freewheel with the clutch in, or put the brake on and put the clutch in sometimes at the same time. But anyway, eventually I learned to drive, and as I was in high school, after I went to high school, well, I would drive for him in the summer. And I went to work for him out in the oil field. And I worked as a roustabout.
Tell us a little bit about what that job entails.
Well, it's just like the connotations of the word, I guess, bring to mind. That is, roustabout, you do just about everything there is. You dig ditches for lines. You lay pipelines. We set up hydraulic casing pulling rig with big timbers. You did tank work, cleaned steel tanks, built bolted steel tanks. Tank work for me was the hottest work in the summer and the coldest in the winter, because the steel was just like it would come out of an oven, you know. And yet in the winter it was cold with the winds blowing.
What kind of work? Were you welding them?
No, these were bolted steel tanks.
Okay.
They were made, you know, with the bolt holes, and then you had rubber gaskets that you put between them, and you put them together. You fit them together with a rubber gasket, and then you put the bolts. You'd have a whole string of bolts you had to tighten up, and you had a chime around the bottom. But my dad then, at that time, when I was in high school, he was in the second-hand supply business in the oil field out of Turnertown. And then I kind of graduated from working as a roustabout. I worked in that supply yard out there. And he would buy old oil field equipment, pipe, tanks, nearly anything. Bring it into the yard, and we would clean it up, and, you know, sometimes it'd be scavenged. You'd take, if it wasn't any good, you'd take off the brass or copper or whatever was good that you could sell. Or if it was good, you'd clean it up and fix it up for resale. But it was a good business in those days, because a lot of independents didn't buy the newest stuff. The big oil companies might, but the independents would.
Mm-hmm.
And so we sold a lot of equipment, and pipe and tanks, to independents. But then, as I graduated from high school, I went to the University of Texas in 1940. I graduated from high school in May of 1940, and entered the University University of Texas, September of 1940.
In Tyler?
No, down at Austin.
Austin.
At that
Oh,
time,
okay.
there was only one university.
That's right. Oh, yeah, that was silly of me.
As Doug Gerash would say,
They were
there's
hopeful.
only one the university.
Yeah. Well, they built that one out there because they had great hopes. Mary Jane told me of.
Well, it's going to be nice. I went out there to a dedication the other day, and Mary John and Ralph Spence fountain, and it's beautiful. And that's a beautiful setting.
Oh yeah.
When we left there, I told Alice, my wife, I said, someday it's going to be those trees just come over the entrance way there, and it's going to be just like a tree arcade or something, driving up there. Because it is a beautiful setting.
Oh yeah.
And I think Tyler's very fortunate to have that out there. I think it'll really grow. And it's like everything, you want something to happen fast, but you can't, it doesn't work that way. Slowly evolves. But anyway, I went to the University of Texas, and I was taking, my course I set out for myself was business and law. I wanted to take a combination degree of business and law. And after the first year, the war clouds in Europe and everything, that was May of '41, I went ahead and went to summer school. And then, in December of '41, there was Pearl Harbor, and I went ahead in school and I volunteered for the service in November of '42 after I was going to summer school. And then that's when I went in. I'd finished, by going to summer school, I'd finished about 3 years of school, which would have enabled me to enter law school, because I had to take 3 years of pre-law in business school, and after you complete the first year of law school, you get your business degree, and then 2 more years of law school, you get a law degree. But the war interrupted my education like it did a lot of people. And when the war was over, I went back to the University in Austin there and completed 1 year and got a business degree, because I felt I was far behind. I think all people did when you went away for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
I felt like, my golly, I'm older, I better get going on life.
Why didn't you take advantage of the GI Bill?
Well, I did for that 1 year, see.
But you could have probably, you
Well,
have gone on
Yeah,
to get more?
Yeah.
Do you regret it?
Well, I don't know. I'm sure all of us regret things in our life, but who knows what would have happened.
Yeah.
I took my degree and majored in real estate and insurance in 1 year. And I went in the real estate and insurance business here in Tyler when I got out. And then later on, I went to work for an oil company. I went to work for Humble Oil and Refining Company. And I worked for them for 13 years. Worked a year over in Libya and Africa.
Oh, you did?
And then I resigned and came back here and went in the insurance business, represented John Hancock Life Insurance. And I stayed in that for some time, and then I guess really, I did some real estate. I was a real estate broker. And then finally I went to work for savings and loan up here as a loan officer. And that's really the last position I had as the vice president of the savings and loan. It started out Tyler Savings and Loan, then became Investex, and then Independent American, and then in 1986 or 7, when everything went in the dump, why the FSLIC took it over and we were all out. So I retired at that time.
Yeah. Let me check this real quick. Check, testing 1, 2, okay.
Okay, checking.
Go ahead.
Well, checking 1,
Yeah,
2,
we're
3,
good.
4. I thought you were going to ask more about the oil business.
I am.
And one of the things to me that is one of the funniest and this is a true story, I knew this man. This is Michael Halberty's book. Is this story about Tom Patton, martial law and hot oil. Tom Patton married the daughter of one of the old pillars of Tyler here, the Herndon girl.
The Herndon?
Huh?
Herndon?
Herndon, yeah.
Herndon.
Judge Herndon. He was a lawyer here in Tyler years ago, owned lots of land. Everything out there on the fairgrounds was all part of the Herndon. And Judge Herndon, he was the attorney in this part of the country for Jay Gould, the railroad. But old Tom, he was a wildcatter and an oil man, Tom Patton was. And he's the one, when they shut down the East Texas field because of hot oil, people running oil wild everywhere, and the price of oil went to about 10 cents a barrel. He's the one that built a penthouse over his wellhead. And see, they wouldn't let you produce it. They shut the field down. Well, Tom had these flow lines, you know, going. He would just have that well going full tilt. And the feds came out there and went around with a metal detector and found his flow line and cut it. And the reason, he said, this is my homestead. And in Texas, my homestead, you cannot come in my homestead unless I give you permission. So they couldn't come up there at the wellhead. They had to go around the wellhead. And it ended up, after they cut the line, he went to Chicago and bought a high-pressure fire hose.
High-pressure what?
Fire hose.
Uh-huh.
And he made that his flow line, where they couldn't detect it with metal. See, he hooked it up with high-pressure.
Well, let me back you up. Now, that wasn't, why was that an issue again?
Well, because the government had shut down the field. The price of oil had dropped to 10 cents a barrel, and everybody was producing oil like mad. There was no allowable, see. Or they
wanted their cut.
They said allowable, and everybody just disregarded it. So they came in and shut the field down. Martial law was declared, and they sent the Rangers up here and everything. But old Tom, he pulled this deal where he built the house on top of the wellhead and called it his homestead. And he said, you can't come in there, and he kept producing the oil until they cut his line. Then he went and got that high-pressure fire hose in Chicago, which was not metal, and he kept producing. And he sold the oil to the fellow that married in Hollywood there. He was a producer, Jack Rather. Jack Rather's father had a refinery at Overton. And he bought all the oil that Tom or anybody would sell. And old Tom would run out of oil over there. And about once a week he'd take a briefcase by there and put it up, and he'd pick it up in there from then, and old man Rather would have filled it with money, and old Tom would go back to his penthouse over his wellhead.
So, because he had the penthouse, he had the rights.
Well, yeah, he had the homestead rights. See, they couldn't come in the penthouse, and he had the wellhead right in the center, so nobody could do the wellhead except him. And they couldn't find where he was getting the oil out. See, after they'd cut the metal line, he had that high pressure. There's a story about it here in Michael Halberty's Oil Boom book, really. But I knew old Tom, and he was like that. He was a wildcatter. He was the type, he went down off the coast of Yucatan and dove for treasure, found a bunch of treasure down there, you know, from the days of the Spaniards and things. He was a character.
What eventually happened? Did they
Well,
find it out, figure it out?
Yeah, eventually what they did, after they declared martial law, well, they shut it down.
What year was that? I'm
Well,
sorry to interrupt you.
I don't know, it was in 33 or 32, something like that. August
Really?
25th, let's see here. I was going to say, General Walters dispatched a military band to play in the oil field. He was Brigadier General Walter. In the early morning, no, it's August 17th, 1931. Walter led 99 officers and 1,104 enlisted men into East Texas to establish military rule over 600 square miles of oil country. And
But I thought the boom really started in 30.
well, it did, but man, they drilled lots of wells by 31.
Yeah.
See, that's another thing. Now, when I worked for Humboldt, they had some people from Germany come over here and, you know, check the field. And these Texas field, these are rough figures, 75 miles long and maybe 30 miles wide in some places, less than others. And there was over 30-something thousand wells drilled out there. And these Germans went over the field, you know, and they came back, and the Humboldt was working with them. And they said, you know, it's amazing. Said in Germany, if we'd had a field this size, we would have probably drilled 75 wells, you know, to produce the field, because the government owned all the minerals over there. Well, what made East Texas unique is you had little plots, and everybody owned their own land, and they owned the minerals, and so they got a right to drill a well on their land, and so, my golly, there was thousands of wells drilled.
I lived and worked for a little while in Casper, Wyoming, which is also an oil town. And they had a boom there, and I remember chatting with a guy, he had a little barbershop, and he said, he remembered, he said they paid a claim, they figured there was oil right under there, and he sold it. He says, set it up right here on the floor. He took the barber chair out, and I don't know what happened, but
well, you know,
Casper's a very depressed town. This is a really nice town compared to Casper, and just for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, I think, you can tell me because you were in oil. It seems to me that there was a lot of irresponsibility at some of the oil companies there. My feeling is that they left a lot of toxic problems there, and that just bailed out of the city.
Well, of course, you know, the thing is, all that's evolved. You take an East Texas field. See, they used to produce salt water with the oil. Well, they'd just run it on the ground for a while. You know, until, and the trees and everything had died.
Then kill everything, yeah.
And they started putting it in pits. They take big pits and put it in there. And it evaporate kind of, see.
Yeah.
And then, of course, they started a program of injection. And they would produce the salt water, and then they would re-inject it into the reservoir on the west side, and that swept the oil to the east side, see, but they were making the reservoir more efficient. They get more oil out than they did. But, you know, it's like in any stage of development sometimes. I mean, people are, and this is probably the biggest field in the world with the most independents working. You had a lot of big companies, but independents, like you say, a little tract or a little thing, anything, they would drill a well. And they had the right because they owned that land. The allowables usually were set based on a certain amount of acreage and the potential of the well. Well, it didn't make any difference how small your tract was. If you owned it, you'd get an exception to what they call Rule 37, which means that if the allowable acreage was, say, 20 acres, and you only had a city lot 50 by 100, you had a right to drill a well on that, because if you didn't, the people next to you were pulling your oil out from under your land. And they would go get an exception to that acreage allowable. And like I say, the well was usually set on so much per well and so much per acreage. Say 50%. 50% for what the well could produce, and 50% on the 20-acre spacing. Only if it was a 50 by 100 foot lot, they'd cut you down on that acreage deal, but you still got the well part, say 50%. So if the allowable was 40 barrels, you'd get 20 for having the well, and then maybe, I don't know, 5 for what your lot was, see, or maybe less, I don't know. So that's what I mean in development where you have a lot of independence. And I don't know about Casper, but most people, when they're boy at first, they're really going after it, you know, and they're not. Nowadays, when you find a reservoir, there's so many regulations and things involved. I think it's developed much more cleanly because of things like that. But out here, my golly, they've got pictures probably in here, you know, you have that salt water running and trees just dying. But they slowly learned, you know, that they had to do it different.
What I understand that this was what the big inch. Tell me a little about that phenomenon.
Well, you mean the pipeline, the big inch pipeline?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think primarily, I don't know, Tennessee Gas, I think, built that thing.
Oh.
And during the war, of course, that was very important because they carried a lot of stuff up to the East Coast that way. I don't know much about it other than that, you know, because I think its head was down in Houston or near Houston somewhere, but it went up to the northeast.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Now, you have pipelines all over East Texas, but not what I would call big inch transmission lines, because you buy a home here, like when you bought a home here in Tyler. In the title policy, they may have an exception in there, something saying Magnolia or Mobile Oil or somebody ran an oil line under this property 50 years ago. And if there's any problem with that, that's an exception to your title fee. But they're all, you know, at one time they were all over East Texas. It's kind of like what they've done with filling stations now, you know, service stations. They wanted all those tanks replaced by a certain time because certain tanks, I think steel tanks, would rust and some of the gasoline would seep out into the sod, you know. And I think they had a deadline on you're supposed to replace all those by a certain time with
They must be
some kind of plastic tank or something.
Yeah.
But it's the same way on now the big inch. All I know, you know, it was a big project.
Yeah.
Now I've worked on pipeline projects when I was with Humboldt.
Tell me a little about your work, what you did.
Well, I was more or less in the office. I worked in all phases of the office. What I was going to tell you about is when we discovered Natchez Field down here near Jacksonville, the Natchez River bottom. I went down there on the construction district we'd set up, and what we did, we laid a line from Natchez up to the gas plant at London. Humboldt had a gas plant at London, and they processed that casing head gas from that field up there at London. They'd take the liquids out of it and then sell the dry gas. At the same time, Humboldt had some production down here in Nacogdoches County, Trawick, which I notice they're still drilling some wells down there in some mines. And we were selling gas to Eastman Kodak in Longview and to Lone Star Steel up at Dangerfield. They were making pipe, steel products up there. In this district, the Natchez construction, we laid the line to London gas plant, then we looped the line. In other words, we put another line in to increase the capacity from Trawick to Eastman Kodak in Longview and to Lone Star Steel. They wanted more gas, so we laid another line. They'd exceed the capacity of the present line. And then we bought nearly all the pipe for that line from Lone Star Steel. They made electric weld pipe. And we had a man, I forgot his name now, I used to, because I used to have to go up there and inspect the pipe and everything, would dope and wrap that pipe at Lone Star Steel, and then we would bring it out on trucks and string it out along the line to lay. It was all welded, you know. We would weld the joints together and then bury the line. But I guess that line's still being used. We had one funny incident on that. I don't know whether you've ever heard of him. Carl Estes. used to, I think, run the paper in Longview, and before that, he'd been in Tyler.
Yeah.
He married Sarah Butler, I think, who was her father, Judge Butler, started the paper here.
Right.
And old Carl, he left Tyler and went to Longview. But anyway, he had a place over there, it's kind of on the outskirts. And when we laid the first line from Trawick up to Eastman and along, we laid it across his farm, so to speak, out there. Well, when we started to loop this line, you know, lay another line alongside, we came to his, and we were out there ready to cross his property, and he came out there. I said, "What are y'all doing?" He said, "Well, we're going to lay another line across here, Mr. Estes." I said, "We have the right, you know, we have the right of way and everything." He said, "Well, I don't want that." I said, "Well, Mr. Estes, I'm sorry, we got the right. Here's the papers." He said, "Would you do me a favor?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Would you wait just till tomorrow before you do anything?" We said, "Well, yeah." You know, we try to cooperate with people. Well, apparently Carl knew somebody in Houston or something, our headquarters. Because the next day we got a notice from Houston said, "Back up about 200 yards out there before you get to his property and get the right of way and go around his property." Apparently he didn't like the way we had backfilled the first time, or he didn't want another line across there or something. But he seemed to have the person in know that could make us do it. He elected the governor of Pennsylvania up there one time. He was a great politician.
Who's this, Estes?
Huh?
Estes?
Yeah, Carl Estes. He was the campaign manager and elected that governor in Pennsylvania.
Oh, okay.
He was a sharp old boy. He was a newspaper man.
Oh, well, but, yeah, that's tough. That's a real tough business.
Yeah, it is.
This is tough too, but newspaper is real hard.
But all in all, you know, I think Tyler benefited from the fact that they never became the oil field workers' town. They were always kind of the financial center. And the oil field workers maybe lived in Kilgore and Longview, the roustabouts and the roughnecks. And Tyler had kind of a clean growth in there.
Mm-hmm.
Longview and Kilgore, they've grown too, but and they're having a clean growth now. I don't want to say that they don't, but there was a lot of, you know, it was kind of a rough era and a rough group sometimes in those cities during the boom time. I don't know whether you've been or not, but over at the East Texas Oil Museum in Kilgore, really gives you a good idea about the boom.
Well, I better get over there, because
yeah,
I've been here about 3 years, and it's going to get to that point where I've been here so long I've never seen the sites over all the tourists go see and all that.
But that would be well worth your time.
I've been right by it many times, yeah.
But you should go in there sometime, Doug.
Okay.
It'd be well worth your time.
Well, I am going to look at glance at your book, but now the oil do you think the oil boom had something to do with the disappearance of especially cotton, or was what contributed to the demise of cotton around here?
Well,
do you have any ideas?
Well,
or
you know, I don't know. I
throwing
do
darts
know
here?
that since, I'd say beginning about the time of the oil boom in the late 20s, East Texas at one time was all cotton, corn, you know, just little crops, and the livestock business was all in West Texas. Well, now it's almost switched. East Texas become the livestock area, and West Texas, say, because of mechanization and irrigation, they grow most of the cotton and the maize, and they grow sunflowers. I mean, they're the big crops out there now. Now, you still have a lot of livestock, big ranches out there. But in East Texas, I bet there's a lot more livestock raised. I'm counting all, you know, cattle, pigs, all that. Now, you've goats and things maybe down in southwest Texas more.
Mm-hmm.
But like you say, it has switched. And I would say I don't know whether it was the only reason, but it had a lot to do with it, because some farmers became wealthy and didn't have to farm anymore, and others, the farming didn't do so good. The crops, you know, the prices weren't good. Cotton wasn't. Caldwell Hughes DeLay and Allen, this place down here on the square, they had a big department store, and in the back they were big cotton traders. I mean, that was their business. Some of my friends I can remember in my church, they were cotton traders back there.
If you go to the Smith County archives, there's a large, it looks like a big credenza, and it was owned by the cotton buyers.
Yeah.
It has all these shelves in it,
Yeah.
and you open the shelf and there's a little, like a bindle, metal bindle, and it'll hold a sample of the cotton.
Yeah.
And who was it who told me? That belonged to Loy Gilbert.
Loy, yeah, I know Loy.
And somehow he gave it, yeah, we
Yeah.
talked to him, but somehow he gave it to them, and when I went to turn the tape in, sure enough, I looked over at the end of the hall, and I said, I think that's it. You were in the Army with him?
With Loy?
Yeah.
No, I know him.
Just
We're
know him.
friends. My wife, Alice Lee, was secretary of the Historical Society back when Alice, his wife, was president of it. And we used to meet in the old Citizen Bank building. And that Julian used to come over from Dallas and give us a talk, Julian Mardell.
Right.
And Lucille, his sister's the one that put out that chronological times or something the Historical Society published, and did a good job.
Is she still alive?
No, she died.
Oh, okay.
Just Sam and Julian left of the 3 children. She was the oldest, but she worked in the oil business. She worked for, I think she retired from Pan Am, which became Amoco, and then she worked for Mr. Byers, B.G. Byers here after she retired from Amoco, and he was an oil man here. Old B.G. was the one that had that. He bought a big bull, a famous bull, something, and kept it in the Blackstone Hotel down there.
He kept it in the...
Well, I mean, you know, he
nearby.
showed it and had it in the Blackstone Hotel. But it was...
That's a funny story.
Oh, yeah.
It must have probably been a big longhorn.
Yeah, well, it was a prize bull.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, he paid a lot of money.
Yeah,
He wanted
yeah,
it to
yeah.
live in a nice place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it didn't live there all the time, but he kept it there for several weeks or something like that, several days. Had it on show and everything. But old B.G., he was a funny guy. I never did know him too well, but I used to live out at Stanford in West Texas, well, north of Abilene. And I'd go to Abilene. I went up to the petroleum club there one time, and I met some people up there, and they said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Tyler, Texas." "Oh," they said, "do you know B.G. Byers?" And I said, "Well, I met him. I don't, you know, we're not in the same social circles, because he was very well-to-do oil man." He said, "Well, he comes out here all the time and wants to play gin rummy." And he said, "We always have to get a syndicate of 6 of us to play him, and we elect one of the syndicate to play him because he wants to play for $25 a point." I said, "My golly." He said, "That's what we said too. That's the only way we can play him. He plays for such high stakes."
Oh, man.
But there's a lot of funny stories about the oil business. Yeah,
what about, tell me about what's the process, like down in Natchez?
Natchez?
It's very different because unlike like Casper, it's just barren.
Well,
So you can see everything.
yeah.
Down
Well,
there,
it's on the plains, kind of. Yeah, you can.
down there, you can't even tell there's oil wells down
Where,
there.
at
till you-
Natchez?
Yeah, till you
No.
get there.
That's right. Well, of course, it's in a highly vegetated area. A lot of that river bottom. When we were developing that field, boy, you'd have bulldozers down there making locations, of, you know, battery locations where you put your tanks and things, and they'd have to wear mosquito netting over their head all the time. They'd just be covered with mosquitoes in that bottom. Well, it's just, but, yeah, and they've gotten, you know, an interesting story down there in Natchez. See, the Natchez River runs right through there.
Yes, I know.
And, the state, in I think the law in Texas, any navigable river, the state owns the minerals. Which meant that if you have a unit set out when they make the field rules, say a unit may be 40 acres, you can drill one well to 40 acres. Well, you know, that river runs all the way through that field, and it's quite a bit of land when you add it all up. And the state decided to put out its, for bid, its royalty interest. In other words, it would get money from the, but they won't know who would give them the best deal. Because what they could do was have a location on the shore and drill it under the river, see. In other words, they couldn't, say you own land adjacent to the river, they couldn't take your oil, but they could maybe buy or lease a location from you and bend it a little, put the bottom under the river, which was the state's minerals. And Humble owned, you know, Humble owned a lot of that whole field. Well, Humble ended up winning the bid. They bid something, I think, I may be off a little, but it was something like 95 to 96% royalty. In other words, if 100 barrels was produced from one of those wells, the state got 95 or 96 of them. And the reason they could do that is Humboldt had most of the land on each side, so it allowed them to drill fewer wells, because they could put part of that with another, you know, on the shore, and they didn't have to drill that many wells.
I see.
You see what?
Yeah.
So they were able to bid real high for that, and it might have saved them money in the long run, even though if they completed a well under the river in the oil minerals that the state owned, they would have to give 95 of every 100 barrels to the state. See,
okay.
But even so, they might not have to drill as many wells that way, and each well cost a certain amount.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that was an interesting story about something that happened down there.
Were they wooden wells initially?
No, they were
They're always
steel.
metal.
Yeah, now in East Texas they were wooden initially.
Yeah.
And you know, there was a big fight in East Texas. We were talking about the salt water.
Yeah.
When they finally decided to re-inject this salt water in the reservoir, they decided to do it on the west side because the natural flow was from west to east.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that meant wherever they produced, they'd have to collect salt water wherever it was produced and then get it over to, and they drilled special injection wells on the west side of the field to put that salt water back in the reservoir under pressure. And of course, as you can imagine, the people that owned the land on the west side said, wait a minute, you're pushing my oil out of the way. And I don't know, but there was a lot of suits over that, and they finally got it settled that it was best for the most to re-inject the salt water, and they get more oil out of it in the long run, and these people. But one company never got in there, and that was Gulf Oil, because of that litigation. They were afraid that, you know, maybe they would do that, and then they'd be held liable for pushing that oil off somebody's property. But it never has. They formed a lot of the companies, and the independents maybe too, I don't know, but they formed what they call the East Texas Saltwater Disposal Company. And their office is still downtown here in Tyler, I think. And that salt water is still being re-injected into that reservoir out there, and has really increased the percentage of recovery in that reservoir, because they're getting a lot more oil out of it than they would have without it. See?
Now the salt water is a byproduct of the crude recovery.
In other words, the reservoir, when you produce the crude, so many times the salt water is in there with it or above it or below it, and when you're producing it, you produce salt water too. And
Right.
you have, in the old days, you had just a settling tank out there, cause the oil would rise to the top, and then you take the oil off, and the salt water you get rid of. Now, then they had heater treaters, they'd heat it, and the oil would drop out in the water, you know. But that all forms of it. And I think one of the things they did to encourage people to do that, they ended up, when I was at London, I worked in the proration office, and they had what they call a bonus allowable for salt water. For every, I've forgotten now, but something like for every 6 or 7 barrels you sold to East Texas Saltwater Disposal, or you delivered to them to re-inject, you would get to produce maybe 1 barrel of oil above your allowance. Now that doesn't mean every day you just produce that 1 barrel for the 6 or 7 barrels you redistributed to be put back in the reservoir. Because when you produce the salt water and the oil, I mean, you take something out of the reservoir, whether it's salt water or oil.
Right.
You know, but by putting that salt water back in, it kind of sweeps the oil in front of it, because they don't mix, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But that was an interesting sidelight too, and there was, well, I'm not familiar with all those suits and things, but there was a big hassle about that, and you can understand it. You know, somebody on the west side saying, well, wait a minute, you're pushing all my oil over that way.
Mm.
But eventually they got it all settled, and it came out. And I think primarily the major companies were the ones that worked for that, because in the long run what they were saying is we'll get a lot more oil out of this reservoir than we would have if we don't re-inject it. And then you have a big disposal problem on the surface if you don't. But you know, for a long time they said a lot of reservoirs they only get 30% of the oil in place. But they've learned, you know, through technology and everything to slowly increase that to a great extent.
What were some of your other duties later on?
Well, when I went to Africa, I went over there on loan from Humboldt to SO Standard Libya. And I went over there as a material man. I was in charge of materials.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, when you're operating in a foreign country, you have to have permits to do everything. And the material section was tremendous. We even carried coffins in our inventory in the warehouse, because if anything happened, I mean, you had to have something that could be taken care of. But it was a tremendous experience, and then they found oil over there, and we drilled lots of wells and produced a lot of oil over there until, you know, finally Gaddafi took it all over from the different companies.
Oh, so what happened with Muammar Gaddafi was he made a decision to nationalize the industry. Is that what happened, or did he simply grab it and then give it to his friends?
I want to tell you the truth. I wasn't there. When I was there, King Idris was there.
Who was it?
King Idris. And he was the king. And Libya was formed as a separate country in 1951 under the United Nations Charter as a constitutional monarchy, kind of like the English or something.
I see.
And Idris was made the king. He had been the leader of the Senussi tribe over in eastern Libya. When the Italians came in there and took Libya, he never did surrender. He finally escaped to Egypt. And when the United Nations formed the constitutional monarchy, Libya, they named him as king of Libya. And he was, when I was there, he was a man of about 72 or 73 years old. And when the oil began to produce and Libya began to get quite a bit of money in, I'll say this for Idris, he was building schools, he was doing a lot of things. Of course, being an older man, you know, he was more interested in trying to improve the country. But you know, in any undeveloped country, things don't happen overnight. Like if you're sitting in this country, you say, well, why don't they do that? Well, if you're over there in that country, maybe there's a good reason. Maybe a lot of people don't want to do that, you know, at that time. But I think he was trying to do the right thing. He was taking the income that was rising all the time, building schools, trying to see Libya. He would spend 6 months in Tripoli and 6 months in Benghazi, and the seat of government would move with him. And then it was some time after I left. I left there in 1960. And well, you know, about a year before I went over there is when Gamal Abdel Nasser, you know, took over from Farouk in Egypt.
Right.
And then
how did that affect things over there a little bit?
Well, I think Nasser was good for Egypt. Yeah. You know, but what I'm getting at is, you know, it seems like many countries, you have to evolve. You can't just go from this to what we have. No, I'm serious. I mean, so many times I think you almost have to go through a dictatorship if you've had something, but as a country develops before they realize, well, we've had enough of this, it isn't any good, now let's go to some sort of democracy or republican form of government, whatever you want to call it. It takes a while. And Gaddafi, I'd never heard of him when I was in Libya. He was a little guy in the army up there.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, Idris was out of the country at one time, and then Gaddafi and his army buddies took over. And what they did eventually, I think, they just confiscated the oil properties. Bunker Hunt and British Petroleum probably lost the most. They had that big Sarir field. It was the largest producer in Libya. It produced something like 400,000 barrels a day. And of course, a lot of the companies, SO lost a lot of the companies did, you know. In fact, while I was there, I say this, I thought SO was a good neighborhood, because there was Shell and SO were the only two marketers of products in Libya. And King Idris apparently wanted a refinery in Libya so that they could produce their own gas and everything. And SO worked with him. They built a 8,000 barrel a day refinery in Rotterdam and floated it down and set that thing in place at Marshall Brega. They did that right after I left. I ordered the pipe for a lot of it. I ordered 100 miles of pipe from the South Durham Steel Works to lay down to our field. It was 100 miles south of Marshall Brega. And they were going to feed that little refinery. Well, 8,000 barrels, I say little refinery, that more than at that time took care of Libya's needs. But, you know, I think they tried to be a good citizen, work with them and everything. But, Gaddafi, I mean, again, it's the involvement of the development of a country. All of a sudden a guy comes in and says, well, you're getting cheated, we want this, and they go with him, and maybe they don't have as good a deal as they had before.
Yeah.
Gosh, when I was there, you had to be very careful about hiring and firing people. They already had unions. I'll never forget, I had one Arab boy that was, his main duty was fix coffee in the morning and bring it around to the different offices and materials, and so everybody could have their coffee at the desk. And I had a black Arab that he spoke English, was a good worker, worked in my pipe yard, and they got in a fight. And you know, I couldn't fire the coffee boy unless I fired the boy. And I had to fire them both.
Oh, man.
You know, and I lost a good worker, and something anybody could have done, but there wasn't any way. You know, boy, their rules were strict. I mean, if they got in a fight, unless it was absolutely, you know, shown it could only be one man, well, then they'd have taken us to task for that. But anyway, it was a great experience over there. I enjoyed it. I stayed a year. They wanted me to stay longer, but I said no. life's too short. I think I'll go home.
Now, you were in Africa?
Yeah.
Whereabouts?
I was there about a year.
Where exactly?
Huh?
Where exactly?
In Tripoli and
Oh,
Benghazi.
yeah.
See, I had a warehouse
Right.
in Benghazi and one in Tripoli.
Right.
And right after I got there, during the time I arrived there, we drilled a well down nearly on the Algerian border. Way down, it's 1,500 miles from the coast of Libya. And it came in maybe about 1,500 barrels a day. We plugged it. Wasn't commercially feasible, you know, to have a line all the way from the coast down there.
Yeah.
The French Foreign Legion was down there and everything. There was another thing, there was an argument about whether it's on Algeria's territory or Libya.
Yeah, yeah.
But one of my first duties was to move those rigs and everything across that desert and move it to another location. We used to have these little Beaver airplanes that fly and talk to the big old trucks, these big old Kenworth trucks that was developed up in Seattle by the timber industry.
Mm-hmm.
And the wheels were taller than I was, and big ones. We had to order them special.
Wow.
But and the tires were that big around. But you know, it was good in the desert because they had a lot of power in the sand where those tires would go. But you'd have a little airplane kind of guide the trucks. You'd have a convoy of trucks, you know, guide them across the sand where to go and everything.
Wow.
Well, it was interesting though.
What was your impression of the people there and the culture in general, aside from the political?
Well, in general, I'd say, you know, of course it was very underdeveloped. The war had been there. One of our biggest problems was landmines. We had British landmine crews and German landmine crews. And you know, the Italians had set landmines, the British had set landmines, the Germans had set landmines. And half the charts were gone, you didn't know them. We had seismic people working out there. And you had to clear an area before you could put people in there. I have pictures.
Were there any accidents?
Oh yeah. I have a picture somewhere. This German crew had just finished taking out 90 some odd anti-tank mines, big old mines, and they took a picture of the crew and the mines and the Jeep or something. They didn't have a Jeep, they had a Land Rover or something. And it ended up, just after the picture was taken, they started to move toward the Land Rover and one of the mines went off. You know, they were very touchy, you never knew what was going to happen. But anyway, as far as the people would go, you know, they'd have, on Tuesday I think it was, they had what they call market day when they'd bring the camels in and trade. And you know, they were an undeveloped country, but they'd been through wars. It was hard to get things going again.
Yeah.
But the oil income was beginning to help them, and Idris realized that. He was an older man. And, you know, one sidelight on it, we planted the Libyan-American Joint Services. It was not ESSO, it was the American government in Libya, Libyan-American Joint Service.
Mm-hmm.
Planted these trees. Well, they use them over there. I forget the name of them now. They use them to keep flies away. But anyway, it was about 30 kilometers to the airport, and they planted all these trees, you know, trying to push the sand back, and did a good job.
Like cypress trees or
No, it wasn't cypress. It begins with an E, I think.
eucalyptus?
Eucalyptus trees. And the darn trees got up about that high and were doing fine. But one morning they went out there and they were all gone. I said, what happened? I said, well, the people came out and cut them for firewood. They thought you'd... But that's what I mean. It was an undeveloped nation.
Yeah.
And you know, they were still doing things the way they had to.
Right.
But I'm sure it's much better now, even with Gaddafi in there. That's what I mean. You got to evolve through different things before.
Yeah.
But you felt sorry for him in some way. You'd go along the street and there'd be a guy wanting to tell your fortune, you know, or something. Materials was a mess. I had a hard time. I had to have they had Jewish stores, Arabic stores, Christian stores, every kind. And the Arabs would be closed on Friday, I think, the Jews on Saturday, and the Christians on Sunday.
That's right.
So you had to develop your buyers that would, you know, go at a certain time.
That's right.
And, you know, it's an adjustment you have to make if you're going to do business there. And now the Italians, see, there were a lot of Italians that had stayed there, were born there. I had a boy work for me, Roger Periente. He was sharp. He spoke about 7 languages. And he was born there in Libya.
I envy people like that.
Well, you know, his family had come down there because Mussolini had said, we'll give you, in some cases they had farms. They'd give them 30 acres and a house up near Derna and Tobruk, which was much better. It was away from the desert.
Right.
And
I've heard of Tobruk.
Yeah, a lot of them would go up there and immigrate from Italy down there. And they got bonuses or something. The Italian government gave them. But Roger had been born and raised there in Libya. And he was the man that I had in charge of the guest house. Later on, I took over services. And the guest house was in my department. And old Roger was sharp. All the directors from Jersey would come through there once Mike Hyder and all the big guys. As soon as they were elected director, Jersey would send them on a world tour to visit all their facilities. And I'd have them, I'd get word they're coming in, and maybe I'd be at work at the office, and I'd pick up the phone, call old Roger, I'd say, Roger, set up a cocktail party tonight for 7 o'clock at the guest house, and do everything right. I'll see you then. Before he could say anything. But I'll tell you, I'd sneak in there about 7:30 and boy, everything was just going great.
Yeah, that sounds like the trick you learned from your brother with the broken dishes.
Yeah, that's right. But no, you know, he was sharp.
Right.
What he did, he was married. He had married and had about 3 or 4 kids. And soon after I left there, Roger left there, because the Libyans, at the time, you could hold dual citizenship. You could be an Italian and a Libyan if you were born there, say, of Italian parentage. But Roger became a Libyan after I left there, because to immigrate to the United States, you had to get on a list. And in Italy, the list was so long, it was about a 5-year waiting period. But in Libya, he was right there. And he came to New York, and he ran one of those coffee houses in New York. I forget the name of it, chock full of nuts or something.
Right.
And the last time I heard from him, I haven't heard from him in 40 years, he went to Florida and was running the hotel down there. But he was a sharp guy. You know, I mean, he knew how to do things.
Be nice to catch up with him someday.
Yeah, it would. I'd like to know.
What an interesting story, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It would be. You're right.
Especially with all that wheeling and dealing.
Yeah.
Mussolini gave him a deal, which was great because he got to get away from Mussolini.
That's right.
Yeah, that's a good story.
And then, like at the guest house there, I had one boy that was a waiter. He was a Sudanese, Brahim. And he wore a long robe and a turban, and he'd wait on the table like the Jersey executives would be there. And they made wine there in Libya, and we'd have that.
Yeah.
Brahim would wait on the table. I'd come down in the morning, and they all knew, see, they were in my department. I signed their paychecks.
Yeah.
Old Brahim, I'd say, Brahim, I want 2 poached eggs and so and so and so and so. And old Brahim would say, yeah, 2 botched eggs. I said, no, not botched. He said, yeah, 2 botched eggs. He couldn't say P. He knew what it was, but he couldn't say P. And you know, you put up with things like he got his vacation. He got a 3-week vacation. He went home to the Sudan. And about 6 weeks later, he came back. I said, where have you been? He said, well, I couldn't get back. You know, you just had to put up with it.
It's, yeah, it's
I
different.
said, well, you realize you don't get paid for that 3 weeks. Oh, yeah, I know, it's all right.
Yeah,
But you know, a lot of the funny things happen like that.
yeah. Well, you got back to,
Got back to
good old Tyler.
in 1960.
Tell me a little about the town then.
Well, the
What was
town,
going on at the time?
well, you know, ever since the oil boom, Tyler's always had a lot of oil people here.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it's headquarters, kind of a district headquarters for oil companies and independents. But it's always been, since that time, kind of an oil center, but again, financial center. You know, your hard-working people or something, I mean, Tyler always seemed to be the headquarters or something. But it ended up, when I went to Houston and resigned, they told me what I was going to be doing, the same thing. I said, well, do you have a secretary? And he said, yeah, one. I said, well, call her in here. He called her in there, and gave her my letter of resignation. And he said, are you sure you want to do this? And I said, yeah. Because at that time is when Exxon and Esso and Humble, you know, they'd merged Humble and Oklahoma Oil and Paid Oil and all those companies, and they'd come up with this new name, Exxon. See, overseas, Esso is still Esso.
Yes, right.
But in North America, it's Exxon.
Which was how many companies?
Oh, it's about 5 companies. It's Humble, Oklahoma Oil, Paid Oil, Carter Oil, and I forget another.
Yeah.
So they were just going through that at that time.
Yeah.
And when I told him, when he was through, I had to go take a physical and everything. When I got through, he said, well, I wish I was going. I'm going through all this change. But no, I told him, I said, well, I have no ill feeling about the company, and I hope I've given them their due. I've worked hard for them. I like them. And I may be down here tomorrow with a deal. But I feel like at my age, if I don't do something else, I want to do something else. I was single at the time. I just got transferred around all the time. And that's why I wanted to come back to Tyler and make it my home, because I've been here. So I came back to Tyler, and of course, my golly, things have changed quite a bit since I've been gone. Now, see, I'd been out, I was at Pampa, up in the Panhandle, and I was at Stanford, and then I went over to Libya, and when I came back, I'd come back for a visit now and then. But I was behind. Green Acres had all developed. That was a new development. I hadn't seen that. They built this high school, Robert E. Lee, seemed like while I was gone. It was out here on the loop. Yeah. And Tyler had grown a lot. But at that time, the oil business was good, you know. And I do think the oil business is a big driving force. The railroad, the Cotton Belt Railroad was a force, but not like it used to be. The railroad kind of faded. And Southern Pacific bought it owned it. And, of course, my wife, her whole family were railroaders. She was born up here on East Cedar Street, North Tyler, and all her dad was a locomotive engineer, and all her uncles and her grandfather and all were locomotive engineers. But that's the way Tyler had a lot of railroad people at that time. Mm-hmm. But it seemed like when I came back that the change had been finished. I mean, it became more of an oil and merchandising center and things like that. To put it in a nutshell, that's my idea.
What, how were things coming along with the civil rights movement here? How would you characterize it in Tyler?
Well, I'd say, like Tyler, being a southern city, you had that old Douglas Battery. It was a big Confederate group. And the civil rights group.
The Douglas Battery, tell me about that.
Well, I don't know. Ms. Douglas taught me civics in school. And her father, Major Douglas, during the Civil War formed the Douglas Battery from Tyler, and they made up that Douglas Battery to go to the Confederate side and fight in the Civil War.
How do you spell that? With one S?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, that's what it is. Well, you know, and then this, what's the...
Well, this doesn't have my name.
This is my card. My name is spelled with two S's.
Okay.
And
What's
what's wrong?
D-E-R-A-S-S-H?
No, my first name, Douglas.
Oh, Douglas. Oh, yeah.
You call me Doug, but
Yeah.
my folks named me after Frederick Douglass.
Uh-huh. Well, I'll be done.
But
Well, do you have a...
I noticed there's a Douglasville up on 155 when you're headed toward I-30.
Yeah.
And I know in northern, after Civil War, a lot of blacks got land up there, and I'm wondering if that happened to be a black settlement, or if that's related to this Douglas battalion. What did you call it? The Douglas
Douglas Battery.
Battery, yeah.
What's the home up here on? You know, I can't remember like I used to. That is right north of the underpass. On the left, it's a museum now.
Oh, the Goodman.
The Goodman Museum. See, the Goodmans live there. They were all at one time. I think Major Douglas is the one that built that house. If I'm not mistaken.
You know, they renovated the outside and
Right.
they're fixing the inside. And
Right.
if you ever get a guy named Boyd who works for them.
Well, I've been through it, of course, but
Yeah.
I've seen all the.
But
different
he
things.
found some neat things. He discovered an extra room that they didn't even know about that existed and then got torn down. He's doing some good investigative work there right now.
Well, and you know, you can look at that house and see in those days, you know, you had high ceilings and big windows so you could have some breeze and everything. But all in all, the civil rights movement, I don't think it was big. Now, you know, you had ladies like Miss Glass, she's dead now.
Yeah, I knew her before she passed.
And you see, you had Texas College here. It's been here for years.
Oh, I
years.
know.
And you had Butler College, which is no more now. It was out here on East Houston, off of East Houston.
And what was Butler College about?
Well, it was a black college, a Negro college.
But this is a different than the newspaper.
Oh yeah, no.
No relation.
I don't know unless maybe, you know, so many times in the South, blacks, well, I'll give you an example. Smith Reynolds, his grandfather or great-grandfather owned a place out here west of town, and his name was Hambert. And he had slaves, and when they left, many of them took the name of the one that they had worked for or were owned by.
Yeah.
So, Douglasville, I don't know, it may have been from that. But you know, a lot of them took the name of the people they were owned by.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. That was common practice in those days.
Right.
But, I don't know, in my opinion, see, my father and mother were raised in Colorado. And my father had always said, you must call them Negroes. Now, they didn't have a lot in Manual High. They had one or two, I think. Where he went to school. That was a poor boy school when he went there, you know, Manual High. But, I lived down on Bonner for a while, and down in that past Augusta, going toward Vine, there used to be a black family that lived down there in a nice house. They worked for the Woolers. And I used to go down there and play with that black boy. We played down in that house. And he'd get mad at me and say, "Oh, go home. You ain't nothing but white trash anyway." But I think Tyler's always been pretty even on the civil rights deal in a way. Now, you've got people on both sides, you know.
Right.
Some of them that are way this way and others that are too far this way. But having those two colleges and things like that, I think, you know, it kind of always had a community relationship that was pretty good.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say you don't have people come out. See, you got a lot of graduates at Texas College that went on to other places and come back. And in other words, they took their BA there and then maybe went on to a master's or something someplace else. The churches also did a lot of support for those causes. But I think Tyler's always been pretty good on that. Maybe not by standards of some places, but some places in the north are worse than some places in the south on civil rights.
I was surprised now that I've lived here, I am surprised to have come to that conclusion. You're right.
Yeah, it is.
I thought I knew everything, and boy was I wrong.
Well, what is it to the Arabs? Does somebody have a saying? Don't criticize or you should always walk another mile in the other man's shoes or something, you know. But generally speaking, I think Tyler's always been pretty good for being in this part of the South on civil rights. Now, I'm not saying that you didn't have the things that were wrong, or maybe on each side. But I know I sat on a jury up here years ago, and Ellick Pope used to be an attorney here. His brother was a doctor, educated in Vienna. They were a fine family here. And old Ellick, he picked it was a 6-man jury in county court, and they were trying a bootlegging case. And the one they were trying was an old black man. Well, they put him on the stand and everything, and he said, well, I didn't do this, I didn't do that. Then they put the lawman on there, and he said, well, we went there, and when we got there, well, they were throwing things up under the house, and we gathered everything up, cans of beer and everything. At that time, the law was different.
Yeah.
And so we heard all the evidence. One of the guys sitting on the jury with him, his name Gene Rest, he was a surveyor. And old Alex, see, he liked to pick white people if you're trying a black man. Of course, he said they got off easier than they did with black people. So we got in the jury room, and old Gene said, I think we ought to get the evidence in here. And it was a case of beer, so he had just a case of beer. What are you going to do? He said, well, maybe we should test this evidence. We didn't, of course. Anyway, we came back with not guilty. And old Harry Loftus was the county attorney at that time. He said, what, Chuck? After he got his Chuck, what in the world were y'all doing? I said, well, Harry, the guy only had 24 cans of beer, and the law says if you don't have over that, they can't take it for granted that you got it for sale. And I said, that's all they came up with, was 24 cans, and that's one case, and that's within the law. He said, yeah, but this man, this is the 7th time we tried him on bootlegging. I said, well, you didn't bring that up. And he said, well, I made a mistake. I didn't file it right, and I couldn't bring that up. So we turned him loose. But old Alec, he kind of knew that, you know, about, they kind of feel sorry for some of them, you know. But that was just a sidelight on
I got a lot of lawyers in my family, criminal lawyers.
Have you?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
my dad's probably the most well-known lawyer in the state of Colorado.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Is he a criminal lawyer?
Yes, he is.
Yeah.
Yes, he is.
Well,
he hits death threats and hate mail, and until those individuals get in trouble, and then all of a sudden they write him, and they really like him, and they would like for him to help them. Suddenly the story changes.
Oh yeah.
But I think what you said earlier was there was a depression. People flocked here.
Oh, they did. They came in on trains, Doug. They had, well, I know a lot of people became millionaires that told me or my dad that they came here with one dime in their pocket, and they ended up making it. But, you know, because of the depression was on, this was one place, for instance, that People's Bank, the old one.
Mm-hmm.
I think the original cost on that was something like $800-something thousand. I'm not exact, I don't know.
Right.
But they got a lot of the marble and stuff from a building in Cleveland that had been canceled during the Depression. And, of course, it wasn't air conditioned at that time. But I think later on it cost more to air condition the thing than it did to build the building.
Oh yeah.
But you know, there was something going on. There was construction, there was all the activity.
Something more interesting than getting worked up
Yeah.
over it. And also, you know, I've noticed it's, well, you've got the Neejams and,
Yeah.
I understand there was a Jewish mayor at one time. I may be wrong on
Yeah,
that.
well, now, lately was old Norman Stockton was a Jewish mayor. He was a mayor. And you talk about that courthouse, or that, where the Historical Society is, that Carnegie building?
Carnegie, yeah.
Rabbi Faber, he donated that land for that Carnegie Library.
I didn't know that.
And his grandson and I were in school together, old Lipstate, John Lipstate. John lives down in Houston now, right north of Houston. And Rabbi Faber was pretty prominent here. He did a lot of. But Neejam, a lot of those people now, like Neejam, I think, I don't know whether he came from the old country over there or what, but he, you know, so many of those people came to East Texas where they could own land, and maybe where they came from, they could not own land. And, you know, boy, when they got ahead a little, they bought this land, and Mr. Neejam, he owned a lot of land around here.
That's what I gathered. Hang on a second. Okay. I'll tell you. Okay.
Ready?
Yep.
Well, this is a picture of Dad Joyner shaking hands with his geologist at the Discovery Well, the Daisy Bradford, actually number 3. They drilled 2 dry holes before they drilled this one.
Okay.
This is Dad Joyner right here with the hat and the tie and white shirt on. And this was his geologist. I don't know who these other gentlemen with ties are, but those others are the roughnecks that worked on the Discovery Well. And actually, it was the Daisy Bradford number load. And you can see the wooden derrick in the background.
Okay, it's going.
Well, you want me to just...
Well, let's see. When did you signed up in November?
November 42.
42, and then where'd they send you?
Well, I went first to San Antonio.
Mm-hmm.
I was in school at Austin, and I left from there. There I was shipped to Shepherd Field, Wichita Falls, where I took basic Army training. I had taken a test to become an aviation cadet. But when I went in, they made me go through basic Army training at Shepherd Field. They shipped me from there to what they call the College Train Detachment at the University of Denver in Denver, Colorado, the place where I was born.
Was that the private University of Denver, not CU Denver? No, yeah, it was University of Denver.
University of
Yeah.
Denver. Denver University is what it actually is. It wasn't CU.
It was DU.
Yeah.
Yes, I know it well.
Well, and we went to school up there. We had classes in physics and different things.
Mm-hmm.
They took the fraternity houses there and rented them, and that's where they put us up, boarded us. We all ate, we had a mess hall in the Kappa Sig fraternity. And you know, I can't remember what was it, the cars were running then. It cost a nickel to go downtown, you know, on those streetcars. See, they were running out there.
No.
And it was a nice experience, but I was only there 6 weeks. They gave us a test when we came, and depending upon the results of that test, you were shipped out accordingly. And I was, fortunately or unfortunately, among the first group that went out.
Yeah.
And we were shipped from there to Santa Ana, California. And there we started our pre-flight training as cadets.